James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's always an honor to rise in this House, and certainly very proud to rise on Bill C-58, an act to amend Canada's Labour Code and the Industrial Relations Board regulations to end the practice in federally regulated workplaces of being able to bring in scab labor. This is something the Democrats and the labor movement have fought for many, many years, and we are determined to make this a reality. I'd like to say at the outset, I want to thank my member, the member from the Kootenays who spoke about the history, because history is important, the history of the Roslyn miners and the Western Federation of Miners and the transformation that they brought across this country. I'm proud to be from Cobalt, where the 17th district of the Western Federation of Miners was formed under Big Jim McGuire. The fact that the fight for the 8-hour day began in the mines of Cobalt. April 28th, the International Day of mourning for workers killed on the job, relates directly to the Cobalt Miners Union 1914, April 28th, winning the right to workers' compensation. Both my grandfathers, Charlie Angus, he died at the Hollinger mine. My other grandfather, Joe McNeil, broke his back underground at the McIntyre mine. Both were members of Mine Mill and then the steel workers. What we see now is that when I was growing up, anybody who came from a mining town had a relative who had been injured or killed on the job. And organized labor fundamentally changed that. The rights of labor to organize, the rights of labor to fight for a better future is the history of our country. And in the United States, they talk about the birth of the middle class in the United States as being the 1938 sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan, where the auto workers were not going to put up with precarious work.
Of order, the honourable member for Yellowhead.
I'd like to mention that the member is mentioning about the United States. We're dealing with Canadian legislation here. Why is he bringing up U.S. situations for?
I want to remind the honourable members, and I've mentioned this on a number of occasions, there is some leeway, and as long as the members bring it back to the bill and relate it to the bill somehow, there is some leeway in the speeches. Another point of order, the honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Yeah, Madam Speaker, I think you're going to see a pattern during the member for Timmins James Bay speech. He's going to give a speech that's on topic, and you're going to see Conservatives stand up on bogus points of order. I'd like the chair to pay attention to this pattern. Thank you.
Again, that was more of a point of debate. I do want to remind members that maybe when they rise on points of orders, it would be best for them to point out the standing order that they are bringing a point of order on. The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Speaker, I'm not surprised that they're trying to shut down a discussion on labor rights. We know the deep anti-labor history of the Conservatives. So if they don't want to know history, they can go have a walk around the block. We know that the modern middle class was formed in Canada in 1945 at the Ford-Windsor strike. That was a follow-up to what happened in 1938 in Flint, Michigan. What happened in Flint, Michigan matters to Canada. Conservatives don't understand that, but it matters because it was the peace of Detroit that established the post-war consensus of labor, capital, and government that started the biggest transformation of wealth and success in the history of the world. The movement of the working class from precarious crap jobs to stable housing, to proper wages, to pensions came out of those strikes. Certainly in my region, the 1941 Kirkland Lake gold miner strike, which was a brutal strike, won the right to collective bargaining. 1973, it was the steel workers going on strike again and again in wildcat strikes. Those were illegal strikes in Elliott Lake that forced the fundamental changes to the Workers' Compensation Act everywhere. Health and safety became a fundamental issue because workers were dying on the job and they weren't going to take it anymore. This is our history. This is a history of New Democrats. This is a history of my family. But the other history is a dark history as well, and it begins in 1980, when we see the planned destruction of the modern working class, middle class that was put in place by the gurus of the conservative movement, Milton Friedman, Frederick Hayek. Frederick Hayek was so opposed to the growth of wealth of the North American working class, that he wrote an essay calling for a planned depression. He wanted to force a depression on North America in order to break the back of the working class. That was picked up by Ronald Reagan. That was picked up by Paul Volcker of the Federal Reserve. And it began in January 1980 with massive increases in interest rates that led to millions of job losses across the United States, and then that spilled over into Canada. What we saw then was that Ronald Reagan targeted the union movement, and from then on, we started to see the loss of rights of workers, the loss of wages, the loss of security. In Canada, that effort was undertaken, but thankfully, we had the solid backing of some very strong labor leaders at the time. Bob White and the United Auto Workers, before they became the Canadian Auto Workers, came out with a no concessions policy. Under any circumstances were they going to give concessions. They stood up to Chrysler. They stood up to GM. They stood up at factory after factory after factory to defend the rights of workers. We know the modern conservatives wouldn't support that. But Bill Davis, who was an old-style conservative, actually sided on a number of occasions with the auto workers along the 401 belt to say that they did have rights, even at a time of massive job losses. So what we saw in the damage that was done from the 1980s on, you can count it in the lost wages and the lost security. The neoliberal attack on worker rights was so overwhelming that in 2022, the RAND Corporation, now the RAND Corporation, well, under this present conservative leader, you might think they're sort of rabid lefties, but they actually usually work for the U.S. military. The RAND Corporation did a study of economic inequality to deal with the issue of democratic instability in the United States. Certainly we see what's happening with MAGA and the issue of economic precarity and the loss of the North American working class and the creation of economic instability and political instability. That over the period from 1980, when the attack on the organized labor in the United States began and what then followed through in Canada, that in the United States today, a black worker is making $26,000 less than they would have if their 1980 wages had remained constant. A college-educated worker is earning between $48,000 and $63,000 less a year. And all that wealth, according to the RAND Institute, was plundered directly for the benefit of the 1%. So what we're seeing is that they identified the loss of wages, pension security, benefits to be in the order of $50 trillion of lost money that belonged to the working and middle class that then was hoovered up and put in the pockets of the 1%. That is what created the political and economic instability of our age. The United States, that loss of income means that for every worker, they lost $1,144 a month, every single month for the last 40 years. That is what created MAGA. So when we see the conservatives talking about, inflation and how hard it is, we've seen no efforts by the conservatives ever to stand with workers, ever, to stand up on these issues. But this is the issue that has to be dealt with. This is why workers came to us again and again to talk about anti-scab, so that we could restore a balance, the balance of negotiations with labor and management, the right of workers to have a seat at the table. And I want to say, I quote Paul Mason in his book, Post-Capitalism. This is a really instructive statement. The destruction of labor's bargaining power was the essence of the entire right-wing project. It was the means to all other ends. Neoliberalism's guiding principle is not free markets, not fiscal discipline, nor sound money, nor privatization and offshoring, not even globalization. All these things were products or byproducts or weapons of its main endeavor to remove organized labor from the equation. That was the whole Milton Friedman, Stephen Harper, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan agenda for the last 40 years. And guess what? Those days are over. Because what we've seen in this past year is unprecedented victory for workers' rights. Now, we just remember just a few years ago, Bill Morneau, remember Bill Morneau, the privatized pension king of Canada? He told, Bill no more, he told young workers, he said, get used to it, suck it up. Precarious, crappy, gig jobs, that's the new normal. That was the new normal for Bill Morneau. And then what happened? Well, we got COVID. We had the break of supply chains. And we had a young generation of workers who said, no, we're not going to put up with crappy work. And they just started to either walk off the jobs, refuse to take the jobs, or they started to organize. And so now what we're seeing in this past year, the UAW, in their strikes against the Big Three, they ended the tiered wages that was forced on them in the 80s and the 90s. Unifor won the biggest wage increase in their history of negotiations with Ford. When the Hollywood writers went on strike, everyone thought they'd cave. They didn't. They won 3 times the original offer that was put on the table. We're seeing young people organizing at Tesla. We're seeing them organizing at Amazon. We're seeing them organizing at Starbucks. And the reason is that they know that they can't count on right-wing governments to protect their interests. They are going to organize. They have a right to be at the table. And the worst thing that we could do is allow scab labor to come into our workplaces to try and undermine their rights, to restore balance, and to have proper wages, proper pensions, proper housing. That's going to be fought by organized labor. This bill has to pass, and we support it as New Democrats.
Questions and comments? The